The similarities between Tolkien and Martin are obvious even to their critics. Both authors created immensely influential fantasy stories set inside vast universes with their own books of lore. Middle-earth's Silmarillion and Westeros' Fire and Blood. According to Martin himself,
before we came up with a title for this, we were calling it G.R.M. the Grimmarillion. It was like my Silmarillion.
But if you put the two books side by side, something feels off. Where Fire and Blood was written after the first 5 books of A Song of Ice and Fire, the Silmarillion was the first thing Tolkien began writing in 1914. Middle-earth was originally envisioned as a mythology that could be for England what Greek and Norse mythologies are for their own cultures. Meaning that Frodo Baggins, Aragorn, everything we know from The Lord of the Rings was invented decades after Tolkien began constructing the universe where the characters actually live. Tolkien was so interested in this backstory that after publishing The Hobbit in 1937, he wanted to finish the Silmarillion instead of writing The Lord of the Rings, saying, quote, "The sequel to The Hobbit has lost my favor, and I have no idea what to do with it. My mind is really preoccupied with the pure mythologies of the Silmarillion. I offered my publisher these legends, but the readers turned that down." But where Tolkien's world preceded his characters, the opposite is true of Martin. Every iconic castle and realm in Game of Thrones was invented after Martin wrote one simple scene: children finding direwolves in the snow.
So, may I ask, when you started A Game of Thrones, how much of this history did you know already?
I knew absolutely none of this history.
Unlike Tolkien's focus on mythology, nothing had a larger influence on Martin than history.
Real history is great. It's full of the most amazing stories. I read some particularly choice bit from history, which I then, steal and file off the numbers and change a few things and stick it in my book.
The famous Red Wedding scene in Game of Thrones was inspired by the Black Dinner of Scotland, and the series itself was largely inspired by England's Wars of the Roses, where, fighting for the English throne, many noble houses learned that
when you play the Game of Thrones, you win, or you die.
Tolkien once said that history and myth are ultimately made of the same stuff. Despite this, he spent much of his life articulating their differences as literary forms, describing The Lord of the Rings as, quote, living on the borders of myth, or rather the story exhibits myth passing into history. There's truth to the idea that in Middle-earth, history begins at the end of the Return of the King, as the elves leave Middle-earth to the rule of mankind, whereas the Silmarillion is, in the words of Tolkien, elf-centered, not anthropocentric, and men only appear in them. But where Tolkien loved building mythologies, Martin loves exposing the humanity beneath mythological figures. And Fire and Blood allows Martin to do this with even greater effect than Game of Thrones. Because this book wasn't merely inspired by events from history, it was inspired by how history itself is recorded.
And then the other thing that got me going was the thought of history. We think we know history, but we don't. We don't have time machines. We rely on the people who pass it down to us, and there are often contradictions.
Fire and Blood actually exists as a book in Westeros, written by an archmaester who compiled 300 years worth of history written by other authors. On the surface, this might sound similar to Tolkien's in-universe explanation for the Silmarillion, that Bilbo translated its stories from earlier Elvish scholars. But the difference, as it often is between Tolkien and Martin, is in the execution. Because despite subjective claims in the Silmarillion, like it is told that something happens, or it is sung that something else occurred, we're never given conflicting reports or reason to doubt the reliability of its text. Whereas Fire and Blood is designed for us to question what we're being told. The book switches between the conflicting accounts of a septon, a maester, and a fool, each skewing history according to their own biases. When recounting the events of the House of the Dragon, Septon Eustace supports the Green Hightowers. Grand Maester Munkun supports the claim of Queen Rhaenyra, and the fool Mushroom is motivated less by politics than by telling the most debauched version of history. As a result, Fire and Blood is littered with references like, "Here is where our sources diverge," and "No reliable accounts survive to this day." Martin adds another layer of bias through the book's fictional author, Archmaester Gildane, who compiles these accounts according to his own motivations hundreds of years after the events actually occurred, leaving the ultimate question of what to believe up to the reader.
This is how Septon Eustace said it went, this is how Grandmaster Orwyle said it went, and this is how Mushroom said it went. And you pick one.
If we've learned anything in the past 15 years since the last A Song of Ice and Fire book was released, it's that George R. Martin enjoys generating ideas as much as he hates revising them into one coherent story, which is exactly what Fire and Blood gave him the freedom to do.
I'm able to have my cake and eat it too in this fictional history. I don't have to decide.
But where Martin is interested in the kinds of things that make history books fun, the conspiracy theories, the affairs, the political machinations, Tolkien was interested in what makes mythology mythology fun, the creation story of a universe, and how evil entered the world. In fact, one reason Tolkien's work is mythological is because it depicts a world where, quote, evil is largely incarnate, through the main villains of Sauron and Morgoth. According to Tolkien, when visibly incarnate evil ends, simple history begins. By that logic, A Song of Ice and Fire is historical, because instead of embodying its evil into a main villain,
My opinion has always been that the battle between good and evil is fought within the individual human heart. All of us have the capacity for good. All of us have the capacity for evil.
For Martin, evil lies inside the human motivations that influence his historical chroniclers as well as the human beings they're chronicling.
You have to consider that Tolkien was a very unusual writer. He was fascinated by myth. The story was almost secondary to Tolkien. He spent years creating his Silmarillion. For him, the world creation was almost primary. You know, they say the 3/4 of an iceberg is hidden below the surface. That was certainly true with Tolkien. We have some ice on a raft, and we want you to think that there's this huge edifice underneath, just like with Tolkien, but there really isn't.
But to many readers, Martin succeeds at making his ice raft feel like an iceberg. YouTube is filled with theories about his world, like that Euron was a failed student of Bloodraven, that the Blackfire rebellions explain Catelyn's mistreatment of Jon Snow, even a possible blood connection between the Starks and the White Walkers. Both authors are so good at making their secondary interests not feel secondary. Despite Tolkien's emphasis on mythology, he was also deeply interested in grounding his work within a sense of history.
I wanted people simply to get inside this story and take it, in a sense, of actual history.
This ends up validating Fire and Blood's Silmarillion nickname in a way Martin probably didn't intend. Because despite every difference, the book is to Martin exactly what the Silmarillion is to Tolkien. It strips away everything the market asked for and leaves only the writer's greatest passions. And while Martin notoriously has a hard time finishing his work, it's less well known that Tolkien never published the Silmarillion in his own lifetime. Tolkien, the man who began with a world, spent the decades after The Lord of the Rings was published trying to work out the philosophical and theological underpinnings of his mythology. And Martin, the man who began with characters, has spent 15 years unable to resolve the human stories at the center of his. Perhaps articulating better than any other example the two authors' similarities.